I will often see that I use specific words that I overuse and like sometimes. And so I'm mindful of that. But I also will tell you, like, I've listened to a podcast before and I'm like, there is no way that this host is not AI because it's so perfect and polished. And, we want to see real people out there, right?
Welcome to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. I'm Tom Schwab, and today we're talking about a mindset shift that changes everything about how you show up as a podcast guest. Now, too many authors, coaches, consultants, and founders still think of podcast interviews as a megaphone. They want more. They want more shows, bigger shows, more downloads, more exposure. But exposure's not the goal. Business is the goal. Trust is the goal. Connection is the goal. My guest today is Kristen Nolan. She's one of our senior client account managers and strategists here at Interview Valet. And she helps us reframe that podcast interviews not as broadcasting, but as borrowed trust. When you show up on a podcast, you're not there to work the room, pitch your product, or impress everyone with your resume. You're stepping into a trusted conversation, one that the host has already built with their audience and sharing with you. The question is, will you use that opportunity to make noise, or will you use it to become a magnet? In this conversation, Kristen shares why strategy beats activity, why better interviews beat more interviews, and how the best podcast guests create connection to drive conversions. Kristen, we've talked before, and you talked a lot about the tactics, right? We talked about things like the mechanics of confidence and storytelling, promotion, and even the funnels after a podcast interview. But before any of that works, something much more fundamental has to be true. And we've been talking about this before, that mindset shift where you find yourself having with almost every new client that comes in that makes everything else click. And can you put words to that name to it, of that fundamental thing of how you see podcast interviews?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times people come and they want big shows, right? They want to be on Joe Rogan, they want to be on those high level shows. And I think and I believe that we need to stop thinking about podcast guesting as broadcasting and start thinking about it more along the lines of borrowed trust, right? Every new client that I work with, whether they're promoting their book or they're trying to build authority, or they're trying to reach a specific buyer, they all come in with that megaphone mindset. And so they want to get on as many shows as possible. They want to get on the big shows. They want to use their podcast interviews as a megaphone. And so I think really having the ability to shift that mindset into it's not a megaphone, it's a magnet. And so we are working to position them so that they're reaching the right audience. They're making the listeners feel like they're speaking directly to them, and just continuing to build upon that.
Yeah, and that's so right. It's like this idea of more, right? AI lets us create more than ever, but it's just noise. And this idea of just a bigger megaphone, turning it to 11, we've never seen that work with people, right? As Eddie Yoon would say, you want to attract your super consumers, those people that buy what you offer and tell the world about that. And it's really that trap of the megaphone. And in the past we've covered this idea of why just telling your story is a mistake, right? And it's the salesy pitfall, and the PT and the whole idea of calls to action problem. But underneath all of those, there's that bigger issue. And so many people fall into it. And what do you really attribute that to?
So I think that, and this goes back to the mindset that I mentioned previously, right? They're thinking like a marketer instead of thinking like a guest. So as I'm speaking with clients, I am coaching and helping them sort of see themselves a little bit differently, right? If we're showing up to a podcast as a guest and we're there to sort of be that used car salesman where we're, promoting our product and we're very aggressive, you're probably not going to get a lot of traction from that. So I always try to explain to my clients that, as a guest, you are there to educate, you are there to share. And we don't want to be everything to everyone. We want to be in front of the right people. So, when a client comes to me and they say, I want to get in front of entrepreneurs, I'm like, great. That's really broad. Let's talk about who are your ideal clients. Give me more specifics about them so that I can utilize that information to be more targeted, to get them in front of the right people.
Well, let's drill down on that a little bit more. That attraction, right? This idea of megaphone is I want to talk to everyone, right? I want to
Mhm.
talk to the entire world. This more is better. And that is a fool's errand right there. That'll keep you on activity. Always that aspiration of the only thing I need is bigger shows, more shows, all the rest of that. And I always push back and say, if you're not converting on the small shows, getting on bigger shows is just, doubling down on failure. So
100%.
what does it really look like when you're attracting the right clients, right? When you think about it from a magnet standpoint, you know, how do you think about the right people showing up and interact in improving so that you can convert and really generating real business, as opposed to just grinding it out? How do you think about that?
Yeah. So I look at it along the lines of strategy, right? Everything comes down to strategy and connection, I would argue. And I mentioned this before, like we're targeting specific people, right? So that's kind of where the strategy comes in. And I think a lot of times people show up and go, okay, I'm gonna be a guest on a podcast and I'm gonna let the host do all the work and I'm gonna sit back and wait for people to reach out to me. And I definitely disagree with that mindset. I would say that it is very important that you come onto a podcast as a guest to connect with the audience. And it starts in the very beginning. And almost every podcast, the host is going to say, tell us about who you are and how did you get to where you are today? And, so many people rattle off a resume and we don't want that, right? Like we want to be able to connect with the audience so they turn you up, they don't turn you off. And so I think starting at that point is so critical to create that connection at the very beginning and then utilizing that strategy throughout the conversation, right? We're not here to sell. We're here to educate and we're here to provide value to that audience while you're borrowing the host trust to continue to be that magnet. And then, going beyond the interview, right? It's not just recording and saying, okay, I'm letting the host do all the heavy lifting. It's really getting in and saying, I'm going to stand alongside of the host and I'm going to, promote and repurpose and share with my audience and continue to provide that value that goes well beyond when the recording stops.
And it's so much of how you show up. And I think of the old days of BNI. If anybody's ever been to one of those, a networking conference, right? And there's the people that show up to make connections, to make relationships and get a lot out of it. And then there's the other ones that just show up to work the room, right? And it's so salesy. And, we internally, we refer to some people as lazy guests, right? So the lazy person at BNI is the one that shows up and, you ask them how it went. Oh, it was great. I gave out 50 business cards. Oh, okay. Right. A lot of activity. And in their mind, if the room was bigger, if there was just more people in there, it would have been a better experience for them. And then the people that understand it are the ones that come ready to serve and connect. You ask them, well, how did it work out? Oh, it was great. I had great conversations with 10 people there. We've got follow-up meetings with them, and it's the start of a relationship. And it's this idea of, do you come up to be salesy in the carnival barker, or are you there to build the relationships, to build that trust? And are you seeing it as the start of something or just a one and done? And we see so many people that, just want to keep on more and more and more interviews, but they don't get anything from the interview. So it's sort of, as we called in the Navy, doubling down on stupid. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it feel like there are some people that feel very transactional, right? And when you come in with a very transactional mindset of like, I'm a guest on your podcast, you give me all of this, I'm expecting to sit back, that mentality is not going to get you far. And so it's really, and what I see from a client perspective is the clients that are going beyond the conversation, right? Are you connecting with the host on their social media channels? Are you sharing the podcast episode and connecting with other people there? Are you developing a relationship where if the host is your they have your ideal target audience, they would be a great partner, right? How can we partner together? How can we, work on other projects? I had a client that she was on a podcast and the host said, "I love our conversation. I love your energy. Can you come and speak at, an in-person event for me?" And so it was able to like compound from there. And so if you're coming in with a transactional, kind of that used car salesman approach, you're missing such a big piece of that networking and of that continued relationship.
yeah. And I think who you referred to is Juliana. And it was interesting because she got on the podcast and she talked to, I don't know, thousands of ideal clients. But then she got invited to the conference to actually talk to them in real life and build the relationships. And so many people would say, I came to this breakout because I listened to your podcast. And that was one of those things where she's like, she used it so well to drive business, to drive those relationships. But yet, some people, they just have that blind spot and they can't see that in themselves. So, how do you look at that and help them understand that magnet versus megaphone um, dilemma?
Yeah. So I think what happens is a lot of times people look at being a podcast guest or podcast interview marketing like other marketing channels, right? So I will often hear people come to me and say, I only want to be on podcasts that have 100 rate and reviews. A podcast is not a product on Amazon. I can tell you myself, I don't I listen to podcasts all the time. I don't typically leave reviews unless I'm asked for one. So as we're thinking about things, and maybe we're comparing, right? Maybe you've done a 30-second commercial where you take, 30 seconds and you talk about yourself and your business and you're sort of rushed. That's entirely different. I look at podcast interviews as an opportunity to sit and have a one-on-one conversation, and it's a great opportunity to highlight, what do you believe in? What do you reject? And who are you as a person, so that you're able to, you're doing better is better, not more interviews. You are having the right conversations with the right people in the right places so that you align everything up so that people listen to you and go, I loved listening to Tom on that podcast. I want to connect with him and learn more.
And I think even the framework you said, do you show up as a marketer? Do you show up as a salesperson? Or do you show up as a human? Right. And when, you put your salesperson hat on, it's what? That always be closing. You try that on a podcast and the interview will never go live, right? Nobody shows up to a podcast because they just miss infomercials, right? They wanted another infomercial. So if you show up that way, it's not going to work. The host is going to be insulted. It'll never go live, right? If you think about it as a marketer and it's all about numbers, right? Of I've got to have all of these metrics. Well, I don't know. Marketers often are focused on activity, whereas owners, right, are focused on the value, the profits. And so I think showing up as a human, as a leader, as a thought leader is the way to do that, right? And have conversations. I've had so many conversations with business owners where they're like, for the last decade, we've been chasing this elusive algorithm, right? With SEO and, we had to do all these different things. And every month it was throwing more and more money at it. And now I find out that that doesn't matter anymore, right? SEO is dead. And they looked at it and said, I've got to be able to understand this. And their point is when I have conversations with the right people, right? When I talk to our ideal client profile, ICP, right? When they get to know, like, and trust us, right? When I build that relationship, business comes from that, right? And so I would say don't show up as a salesperson.
Mhm.
Don't show up as a marketer. Show up as a human, as a peer, as a thought leader, as the face of the company, and that will drive long-term business.
Absolutely. And I think, as we look at the landscape today, right? Like AI is emerging. We've talked a lot about how, AI has sort of changed the landscape. And I think the best thing that someone can have is authenticity and connection. So if I'm showing up as a human and I am having a mindset of I'm here to educate, I'm here to share, my service or my product, it comes from a place where people naturally go, that's a really great idea, right? And so I will often tell my clients, as you're sort of framing that initial question on a podcast, you want to share a story that the listeners can see themselves in, right? So if I am on a podcast and it's catered to, let's say, home service based business owners, I'm going to give a story that they can relate to. I'm not going to have the same conversation with every single host regardless of the podcast. I'm going to make my information that I'm sharing relatable to that audience so that they're able to fully understand what it is that I offer. And then I'm going to give them, like, I can't tell you, I've listened to quite a few podcasts, and there are so many times that I'll go, is this person talking directly to me? Like, I feel like there's just like this connection. And so when we're able to adequately share that information, we can then provide so much more value, right? We're not just like talking, we're having a conversation and we're providing value.
Yeah, and I think one of them builds upon itself, and the other one just decays and fades away, right? There's so much of marketing where you spend $1 today, it's gone tomorrow, right? I think of a Facebook ad, right? Or even sometimes a blog, right? I've never gotten business from a blog that I wrote years ago, but conversations, podcast interviews, I have. And it seems like one of them decays away, right? It fades. But when you're a magnet, it sort of compounds. And, do you see a deeper reason in that and why you can, what you've seen with clients as they're doing this more and more?
Yeah, I feel like as we're doing this, right? Like it takes some time to sort of ramp up. And then when we talk about your digital footprint, right? So, how do people view you on the internet? And I often give this analogy for a lot of different things, but I look at it as planting seeds, right? Like you talk about the blogs and different things like that. Those are all sort of like seed planting things that I feel like, used in conjunction and strategically help. But I think, I had a client and when I went to, search for him in the beginning of his campaign, I will typically go, who is XYZ client to get a better fit for who they are and what does it look like online for them, right? And I started doing this because I had a client that came to me and we were promoting his book. And he kept coming to me and be like, I don't understand. Like, the hosts have my book, but they're asking me questions, about marketing. And like, that's not what's in my book. But what it was is that his background was in marketing. So, what we're looking at is how are you aligning your digital footprint, right? When you're going to be, if people are going to search you and they say, who is Tom Schwab? You know, are we having the right kind of things that are showing up online? Or is it something that we've done previously? Or different things like that. So I think it's so critical that we are mindful of like what's out there about us and how do we influence that. So podcast interviews are a great way to do that because you're able to, consistently have, uh, you know, hosts will put the episode on their website, right? So you're getting, LMO or AI indexing value. I'm not sure what the correct term is these days, so I apologize. But you're able to really get those benefits of it to help kind of boost that, right? So if you're sharing a new book that maybe is unrelated to what you've previously done, you're able to then, have some influence in how you are viewed online.
And, your digital presence is so important today. And as you make the point there, there are times where people they're past doesn't reflect their future, right? Um, and you see what they used to do, not what they're going to do. And if you think it's hard for people to figure out who you are, imagine AI, right? And if it doesn't know who you are and what you're going to do or what you're doing, you can be, digitally dead almost. And I'll give you an example. So many times we work with CEOs that they know they have to retire at a certain point, right? The board has told them when you're 62, you retire, we're bringing the new person in. Well, you can go really quickly from the CEO of a major company to unknown, right? That all they know is you were the past person. So they will intentionally start ramping up their new brand, their personal brand, their personal thought leadership as their old career is sunsetting in. And that's one of the things that we talk also about clients with is that as you're putting out your content there, it's got to be fresh. It's got to be new. If you're still talking about the same things that you were, oh, you know, a year ago, boy, that's probably a commodity in the market now, right? So you should always be talking about what's next, what you're thinking about, because AI can give us the answers about the past, but only people can give us the vision of the future. So I think that's a key point there too. And then the other thing that you mentioned in there, I've heard referred to as proof of life,
Hmm.
right? With so much AI content out there, there's all this information, right? And you're like, was this written by AI, right? I've never seen Tom use M dashes or semicolons before. And you can just start to get that feel for it. And I think that breaks trust. All of a sudden you start sounding like worse than a marketer, an AI marketer or an AI salesperson, right? Better to sound like a person. And that's what conversations are doing.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes you relatable, right? Like if you sound too polished, and I know, and I just used an but I know one of the, we do an interview analysis for clients, right? And so I will often see that I use specific words that I overuse and like sometimes. And so I'm mindful of that, but I also will tell you, like, I've listened to a podcast before and I'm like, there is no way that this host is not AI because it's so perfect and polished. And, we want to see real people out there, right? Like anyone can create, this AI persona and talk about things, but really being able to be true to who you are and what you believe in and sharing that on a podcast episode with someone. I always say the best podcasts that I enjoy listening to feel like two people, two strangers in a coffee shop, and I'm just sort of sitting there listening to them have a conversation and it provides me value and I learned something. And I feel like that is something that we need in today's age, right? Like we need that authenticity, we need that connection. And so really leaning into that
Yeah,
is
and
super important.
the more we get automated, the more human stands out with that. And so to wrap it up here, if someone's, nodding along today, they're like, yes, stop the megaphone, stop making noise and start attracting people. And they recognize that the megaphone model isn't working and that they're looking to make that shift, but they don't know where to start. What's that practical first step in going from megaphone marketing to magnetic attraction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, I think we need to look at it as, the magnetic model, it compounds, right? The megaphone is just spending, whether that's, money for ads or time for, just kind of doing more interviews and hoping that something sticks. I think that the real core value of all of this and how you, utilize the magnetic model is that you have a strategy behind it, right? Anyone can go out there and draft a couple of AI things. Maybe they get on a couple of podcasts. They go out there and they have a conversation and they go, "Okay, I've checked that box," right? It's so important to have a strategy behind it and to have a plan on how do you execute that strategy, right? Are you getting in front of the right people? Are you having the right conversations? Are you doing all of the things to be someone that people want to come and speak with? And so I feel like really at the core of that is getting very, very, in depth with being most strategic with it.
Without strategy, it's just activity. And I say this often is that most people that are doing podcast guesting, it's an expensive hobby, and then they wonder why it doesn't work, right? There's a difference between just going out and playing golf and being a professional golfer, right? One's an activity, the other one is a strategy. There's a way to do that. So, Kristen, thank you so much. What's ordinary to you is amazing to others, and I hope this helps people to move from just making noise to attracting their ideal clients.
Thanks, Tom.
What a great conversation with Kristen Nolan. The big takeaway I have is that podcast interviews should not be a megaphone, but a magnet. The megaphone mindset says, get me on more shows, get me on bigger shows, let me talk to everyone. But the magnetic strategy says, put me in front of the right people with the right message in the right conversations. So trust and real results can compound. That is what makes podcast interview marketing so powerful. You're borrowing the host's trust, but you have to honor that trust. You do that by showing up as a human, not as a salesperson, not as a marketer. You educate, you connect, you tell stories the listeners can see themselves in. You continue the relationship after the recording stops. So here's your next step. Before your next interview, ask yourself, who exactly am I here to serve? And what conversations do they need to hear today? Not what do I want to promote or what do I want to prove, but what do they need? Because without strategy, podcast guesting, it's just an activity. But with strategy, every interview can become a seed that grows your brand, your authority, and your business.